A terrified Bobcat Kitten is found huddled against a cliff, claws shaking, nowhere to run. But when a stranger steps in to save him, what begins as a desperate rescue turns into something far more dangerous. Because this kitten isn't just lost. He's the key to a secret that powerful men will do anything to keep hidden. From a breathtaking rescue to a fight for survival, every hug this tiny creature gives his savior pulls her deeper into a battle she never expected. Why was this helpless kitten targeted in the first place? And how far will his enemies go to tear them apart? Before we dive in, drop a quick hello in the comments, maybe your name, maybe your city. Every reply reminds me this isn't just my voice, but our space. The autumn wind whispered through the canyon walls, as Clara Dinsmore pulled her worn denim jacket tighter around her shoulders. Her work boots crunched softly against the gravel path that wound along the canyon rim, a route she'd walked hundreds of times before. The setting sun painted the red rocks in deep crimson and gold, usually bringing her peace after long days at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, but tonight felt different. A sound caught her attention, faint at first, barely distinguishable from the evening breeze. Clara paused, tilting her head to listen. There it came again, a desperate, frightened cry that made her heart clench. Without hesitation, she left the marked trail, carefully picking her way between weather-worn boulders toward the source of the sound. "Hello," she called softly, not wanting to startle whatever creature was in distress. The crying grew louder. As she approached a narrow ledge overlooking a steep drop, Clara's breath caught in her throat when she spotted the source, a small bobcat kitten, probably no more than 8 weeks old, pressed against the canyon wall. Its spotted fur was fluffed up in terror, and its blue-gray eyes were wide with fear. "Oh, sweetheart," Clara whispered, her heart breaking at the sight. The kitten was trapped on the ledge, too frightened to move forward or back. Years of working with injured wildlife had taught her to recognize animals in crisis, and this little one was definitely in trouble. She took a careful step forward, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. The kitten let out another pitiful cry, and Clara was about to respond when a different sound froze her in place. The unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel behind her. Well, what do we have here?" The voice was rough, carrying a note of cruel satisfaction that made Clara's skin crawl. She turned slowly to face Raymond Kettler, her stomach dropping at the sight of the rifle cradled in his arms. She'd heard whispers about him in town, a hunter with a reputation for pushing boundaries and showing no mercy to his targets. Raymond's weathered face split into a predatory smile as he assessed the situation. "Step aside, girl. That's a prime specimen right there." He adjusted his grip on the rifle, the metal gleaming dully in the fading light. Clara's throat went dry, but she didn't move. Instead, she found herself taking a small step backward, positioning herself more firmly between the hunter and the frightened kitten. Her hands trembled slightly, but she clasped them together to steady them. "No," she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "This is a baby, Mr. Kettler. It needs help, not harm." Raymond's expression darkened. "You don't want to interfere with my business, Missy. That there's a rare color variation worth good money to the right buyer." He took a menacing step forward. Last chance to move. Clara felt a surge of anger cut through her fear. The thought of this beautiful creature being sold as a trophy made her blood boil. "This is a protected species," she said, her voice growing stronger. "And we're on preserved land. You have no right to hunt here." "Rights?" Raymond let out a harsh laugh. "Out here, rights belong to whoever's got the power to take what they want." He raised the rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at her, but leaving the threat implicit. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but something inside her refused to back down. Maybe it was all those years of being called too soft, too gentle, too weak to make a difference. Maybe it was the desperate cries of the kitten behind her. Whatever the reason, she found herself standing taller. "If you want this kitten," she said quietly, "you'll have to go through me first." For a long moment, they stood locked in a silent battle of wills. Clara could see the calculations running behind Raymond's cold eyes, wondering if the risk of dealing with a witness was worth his prize. The kitten mewled again, and Clara took advantage of Raymond's momentary distraction. In one fluid motion, she turned and scooped up the terrified creature, cradling it against her chest. The kitten's claws dug into her jacket, but it didn't try to escape, perhaps sensing she was its only hope for survival. "This is your mistake," Raymond snarled, but Clara was already moving, picking her way quickly but carefully back toward the main trail. Her heart pounded with each step, expecting to feel the bite of a bullet at any moment. But something, perhaps the growing darkness, or the risk of being seen by other hikers, held Raymond back. "You'll regret this." His voice echoed off the canyon walls, following her as she half ran half stumbled along the path. "Nobody crosses me and gets away with it." Clara didn't slow down until she'd put several bends in the trail between them. Only then did she pause to catch her breath, her legs shaking with delayed reaction to what she'd just done. The kitten trembled against her chest, its tiny heart racing as fast as her own. "It's okay," she whispered, gently stroking its spotted fur. "You're safe now. I've got you." But even as she spoke the comforting words, Raymond's furious face blazed in her memory. She knew, with chilling certainty, that this wasn't over. Looking down at the precious bundle in her arms, Clara felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her. This vulnerable creature had awakened something in her, a courage she hadn't known she possessed. Whatever came next, she would face it. She had to, for both their sakes. The sun had nearly set now, painting the canyon in deepening shadows. Clara quickened her pace, heading for the safety of her truck. Each step took her further from the confrontation, but Raymond's threats echoed in her mind. She'd crossed a dangerous man to save this little life, and she knew there would be consequences. Still, as the kitten gradually relaxed in her arms, Clara felt no regret. For the first time in her life, she'd stood her ground when it truly mattered. She might be known as the gentle soul who nursed injured birds and rescued abandoned fawns, but tonight she'd discovered a steel core beneath her soft exterior. The parking lot came into view, and Clara let out a shaky breath of relief. Her old blue pickup truck waited there like a faithful friend, promising escape from this surreal evening. As she carefully opened the passenger door, planning how to secure the kitten for the drive to the rehabilitation center, she heard distant footsteps on the trail behind her. She didn't look back. Instead, she quickly slipped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot. In her rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of a figure emerging from the twilight. Raymond, watching her departure with cold, calculating eyes. The kitten stirred against her jacket, and Clara spared a hand from the steering wheel to stroke its soft fur. "Don't worry, little one," she murmured. "Whatever happens next, we'll face it together." As she drove through the gathering darkness toward town, Clara knew she'd crossed a line tonight. She'd chosen to stand between an innocent creature and a predator, and in doing so, she'd made herself a target. But looking down at the precious life she'd saved, she felt something unfamiliar blooming in her chest. Pride, mixed with the determination she'd never known before. The gentle wildlife rehabilitation assistant who'd started her evening walk was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who'd discovered that being soft-hearted didn't mean being weak. Whatever Raymond Kettler planned next, she would be ready. Clara's heart thundered in her chest as she hurried away from the cliff edge. The Bobcat Kitten clutched protectively against her. The tiny creature's claws had latched onto her shirt, and she could feel its rapid heartbeat matching her own. Raymond Kettler's final words echoed in her ears, carried on the evening wind. "You'll regret this." The quarter-mile walk to her cabin seemed to stretch endlessly. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf made her jump, imagining Raymond's hulking figure emerging from the deepening shadows. The kitten remained surprisingly still against her chest, as if sensing the need for silence. Finally, the warm yellow porch light of her small cabin came into view through the trees. Clara fumbled with her keys, hands shaking as she unlocked the door and quickly stepped inside. Only when the deadbolt clicked into place did she allow herself to take a deep breath. "We're safe now, little one," she whispered, gently stroking the kitten's spotted fur. The creature looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes, still clinging to her shirt. Clara couldn't help but marvel at how quickly it had gone from terrified wild animal to seeking comfort in her arms. Her cabin, though modest, was a haven of warmth and security. The main room held a well-worn couch, a small kitchen area, and walls lined with books about wildlife rehabilitation. Moving carefully so as not to startle the kitten, Clara gathered supplies, a soft towel, a heating pad, and some water. "First things first," she murmured, setting up a makeshift nest on her kitchen counter. "Let's make sure you're not hurt." The kitten allowed her to check it over, only flinching slightly when she examined its paws. No visible injuries, just exhaustion and fear. As Clara worked, Raymond's threat kept surfacing in her mind. She knew his type, men who saw themselves as above the law, who treated wildlife as personal property to be claimed or destroyed at will. The darkness outside her window suddenly seemed more menacing. Sleep came fitfully that night. The kitten had settled into a box beside her bed, but Clara found herself starting awake at every sound, imagining footsteps on her porch or shadows at her windows. Morning brought a false sense of security with its bright sunshine and chirping birds. Clara called the wildlife center as soon as her shift was supposed to start, explaining her absence and the previous night's rescue. "You did what?" Her supervisor, Mark, sounded more exasperated than impressed. "Clara, you know better than to approach a wild animal without proper equipment and confronting an armed hunter. What were you thinking?" "I couldn't just leave it there," Clara protested, watching the kitten lap at a bowl of water. "Raymond Kettler would have killed it." "Kettler," Mark's voice sharpened. "Clara, that man has connections all over the county. You need to be more careful." The conversation with her other colleagues went similarly. Even Sarah, usually her strongest ally at work, seemed distant. "Maybe you should just bring the kitten in and let someone else handle it," Sarah suggested carefully. "You don't want to make enemies around here." Their dismissal stung more than Clara wanted to admit. She'd worked at the center for 3 years, earned her certifications, handled countless rescues, but one act of defiance seemed to have erased all that. The first sign of trouble came that afternoon. Clara stepped outside to check her mail and found her truck's tires slashed, all 4 of them deflated in silent accusation. Her hands trembled as she took photos with her phone, though she knew filing a police report would be useless without proof. Over the next few days, the intimidation escalated. Dark trucks with tinted windows drove slowly past her cabin at odd hours. She spotted unfamiliar men lounging against trees at the edge of her property, disappearing when she tried to get a closer look. One morning she found bootprints in the soil beneath her bedroom window. The kitten, which she'd started calling Shadow, seemed to sense her growing unease. It stayed close, watching the windows with alert eyes and growling softly at unexpected sounds. Clara found herself grateful for its company, even as she worried about what she'd gotten them both into. 5 days after the rescue, Clara was preparing Shadow's evening meal when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Pinned to her back door with a hunting knife was a crudely drawn map of the local canyon system, with several locations marked in red. In the corner, someone had sketched a crude image of a dead bobcat. Standing there in her kitchen, Clara realized she'd stumbled into something much bigger than a simple wildlife rescue. The intensity of Raymond's retaliation, the marked locations on the map, her colleague's strange behavior, it all pointed to something organized, something hidden. "What have we gotten ourselves into, Shadow?" she whispered, scratching behind the kitten's ears. The little creature pressed against her hand, purring softly, offering comfort even as Clara's mind raced with questions. Whatever was going on, she had a feeling Raymond Kettler's interest in that Bobcat Kitten wasn't just about hunting trophies. As darkness fell outside her cabin windows, Clara double-checked her locks and drew the curtains tight. She'd have to be careful now, very careful. Something told her this was just the beginning, and Raymond Kettler's threats were more than just angry words thrown in the heat of the moment. There was something deeper here, something that made people look away and stay quiet, and she had just stepped right into the middle of it. The kitten curled up in her lap as she sat on the couch, both of them alert to every sound from the forest. Outside, Clara stroked its soft fur, drawing comfort from its presence while trying to figure out her next move. One thing was certain, she couldn't back down now, not when she was starting to suspect that Shadow might be connected to something far more sinister than simple poaching. The darkness outside, her window suddenly seemed more threatening than usual. Clara knew she needed help, someone to talk to who would understand. Pulling out her phone, she dialed a familiar number. "Iris, can you come over? I need your advice on something important." 20 minutes later, Iris Martinez's beat-up blue Subaru pulled into Clara's gravel driveway. The veterinary nurse had been Clara's closest friend since they'd started working together at the Wildlife Center 3 years ago. Even after a long day at the clinic, Iris's warm brown eyes were alert and concerned as she stepped into the cabin. "Oh, my goodness," Iris breathed, catching sight of the Bobcat Kitten curled up in its makeshift nest. "So this is what all the fuss is about." She moved closer, her experienced gaze assessing the animal's condition. Clara paced the small living room, wringing her hands. "Raymond Kettler was going to shoot it, Iris, right there on protected land. I couldn't just stand by and watch." "Of course you couldn't," Iris said firmly, reaching out to stop Clara's nervous movement. "That's not who you are. Tell me everything." Over cups of herbal tea, Clara recounted the evening's events. The kitten's cries, Raymond's threatening presence, her impulsive decision to intervene. Iris listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each detail. "His threat wasn't empty," Clara concluded, wrapping her hands around her mug for warmth. "You know his reputation. He's connected to all those suspicious hunting incidents last season, the ones nobody could prove." Iris set her cup down with a decisive clink. "You need to tell Nate about this." Clara stiffened at the mention of her brother's name. "Nate? He barely speaks to me anymore. Besides, he'll just say I'm being dramatic. He's still a sheriff's deputy, Clara, and whatever issues you two have. He's your brother. Raymond Kettler is dangerous. You need someone in law enforcement on your side." The kitten stirred in its nest, letting out a tiny mewl. Clara went to it immediately, and the creature climbed onto her shoulder, pressing against her neck. The simple trust of this wild animal made her throat tight with emotion. "Maybe you're right," she conceded softly, stroking the kitten's fur. "But I haven't even been to the station since Dad's funeral." Iris's expression softened. "I know, it's hard, but this is bigger than old family wounds. Promise me you'll try." Clara nodded slowly, though her stomach churned at the thought of facing her brother. The next morning, she called in sick to work and drove her truck into town. The sheriff's department occupied an unremarkable brick building on Main Street, its windows reflecting the bright autumn sunlight. Inside, the familiar smell of coffee and paper brought back memories of visiting her father at work. Clara approached the front desk, her heart pounding. "Is Deputy Densmore available?" 5 minutes later, Nate appeared in the hallway. He looked older than Clara remembered, his dark hair starting to gray at the temples, just like their father's. His expression was carefully neutral as he led her to a small conference room. "This is a surprise," he said, closing the door behind them. "What brings you here?" Clara took a deep breath and launched into her story. With each word, she could see Nate's professional mask slipping, replaced by the skeptical big brother she remembered from childhood. "So let me get this straight," he interrupted, pinching the bridge of his nose. You confronted an armed man, stole what he claims was his legal prey, and now you're worried he's following you, because, what, you saw someone near your cabin? It's not that simple, Nate, Clara protested. Raymond Kettler is known for being a jerk. Yeah, but he's never been convicted of anything. Look, Clara, I know you mean well, but you can't just accuse people without evidence. And technically, you're the one who broke the law by interfering with a hunter. He was hunting illegally, in a protected area. Nate sighed heavily. Did you see his permits? Do you have proof he was outside the designated hunting zones? Because without that, it's just your word against his. Each question felt like a personal attack, reopening old wounds. Clara remembered all the times growing up when Nate had sided with their father, dismissing her over-emotional concerns about injured animals or environmental issues. I thought maybe you'd changed, she said quietly, standing up. That may be. Now you'd listen instead of just assuming I'm being hysterical. Clara, wait, Nate called after her, but she was already walking away, vision blurred with angry tears. Angry tears. The drive home was a blur of autumn colors and bitter memories. Clara pulled into her driveway, exhausted and heartsick. Inside, the Bobcat Kitten greeted her with a chirping sound, immediately climbing onto her lap when she sat down on the couch. At least you believe in me, she whispered, scratching behind its ears. The kitten's steady purr and warm weight against her chest felt like a tiny vote of confidence. Despite Nate's dismissal, despite her growing fear of Raymond's retaliation, Clara knew she had made the right choice that evening on the cliff. The kitten had started following her everywhere, to the kitchen while she cooked, to the bathroom door, even trying to climb into the shower with her. Its constant presence, while sometimes inconvenient, gave her a strange sense of courage. If this small wild creature could trust her so completely, maybe she could trust herself to. Clara pulled out her phone and began researching wildlife protection, laws, sanctuary contacts, and security cameras for the cabin. If no one else would help her protect this innocent life, she would find a way to do it herself. The Bobcat Kitten kneaded her leg with tiny paws, as if encouraging her determination. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk called. Clara's cabin felt like both a sanctuary and a fortress, a place where she would make her stand, not just for this one small life in her care, but for everything she believed in. The autumn wind whistled through the pine trees surrounding Clara's cabin, creating eerie shadows that danced across her walls. It had been 3 days since her conversation with Iris, and Raymond's presence had grown more menacing with each passing sunset. Clara stood at her kitchen window, absently stroking the Bobcat Kitten, who was now constantly at her side, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee mug. Earlier that morning, she had found fresh boot prints in the mud beneath her bedroom window. They weren't her own. The heavy treads belonged to someone much larger, someone who had been watching her sleep. The kitten tensed suddenly, its ears pricking forward. Clara froze, listening intently. There, the sound of gravel crunching under tires. A vehicle was approaching, moving slowly up her remote driveway. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she peered through the gathering dusk. A dark pickup truck rolled to a stop, its headlights cutting through the misty evening air. Clara recognized the distinctive dents in the passenger door. It was Raymond's truck. Without hesitation, she scooped up the kitten and moved swiftly through her small cabin. Heading for the crawl space she had prepared as a hiding place days ago, the loose floorboard in her bedroom closet lifted silently, revealing a narrow space beneath. Clara had lined it with an old sleeping bag and stocked it with water and some emergency supplies, just in case. Now, she was grateful for her paranoid preparation. She lowered herself and the kitten into the musty space, pulling the board back into place above them. Heavy boots thudded on her front porch. Clara held her breath, cradling the trembling kitten against her chest. The front door rattled as Raymond tested the lock. Then came the sound of something scratching against wood. He was leaving a message. I know you're in there, Clara. Raymond's voice carried through the walls, rough with barely contained anger. You can't hide forever. That cat's worth more than you know, and you're messing with the wrong people. Clara pressed herself deeper into the crawl space, her hand gentle but firm around the kitten's muzzle to keep it quiet. The boots circled the cabin slowly, methodically. At each window, she could hear Raymond pause, probably trying to peer inside. The kitten trembled against her, but remained silent, as if understanding the gravity of their situation. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, the truck's engine roared to life, and the sound of tires on gravel gradually faded. Into the distance, Clara waited another 30 minutes before carefully emerging from their hiding place, her joints stiff from staying so still. The message Raymond had carved into her front door made her blood run cold. Last warning. That night, Clara barely slept. She sat at her small dining table with her laptop, the kitten curled in her lap, diving deep into local news archives. Raymond's words echoed in her mind. The cat's worth more than you know. There had to be more to this story. As the sun rose, Clara arrived early at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, determined to dig deeper. She made her way to the records room, where years of incident reports were filed away. Her colleagues were used to seeing her arrive first, so no one questioned her presence as she began pulling folders. "Hey Clara." Sarah, one of the senior rehabilitators, stuck her head in the door. "You okay? You look like you haven't slept." Clara forced a smile. "Just doing some research on local bobcat populations. Something's been bothering me about recent patterns." Sarah's expression shifted slightly, a flash of concern crossing her features. "Be careful what you go digging into," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder before stepping into the room. "There have been whispers about organized groups targeting certain species. Nothing we could ever prove. But what kind of groups?" Clara pressed, her heart racing. Sarah lowered her voice further. "Wildlife trafficking, high-end collectors, illegal, pet trade, traditional medicine markets. The money involved?" She shook her head. "Just watch yourself." "Okay." As Sarah left, Clara's hands flew over the keyboard, connecting two databases of reported incidents. Patterns emerged from the data, specific species vanishing from certain areas. Unexplained injuries to animals that suggested failed capture attempts, mysterious vehicles reported near protected areas. The kitten in her care wasn't just a random rescue. It was evidence. Raymond wasn't acting alone. He was part of a network, a systematic operation targeting valuable wildlife. The realization settled like ice in her stomach. She had stumbled onto something much bigger than a single poacher's vendetta. Looking down at the sleeping kitten and its carrier beside her desk, Clara felt a new wave of determination. This tiny creature wasn't just an animal in need. It was proof of an illegal operation that had probably been running unchecked for years. If she could document everything, gather enough evidence. But Raymond's threats loomed larger now. He wasn't just an angry hunter she had thwarted. He was a criminal protecting a profitable enterprise. The danger was real, and it was growing. Clara's hands shook as she copied key files onto her flash drive, but her jaw was set with determination. She had started this by saving one small life, and now she had to see it through, not just for the kitten, but for all the animals that had disappeared into this dark network. As she drove home that evening, Clara kept checking her rearview mirror, watching for Raymond's truck. The kitten dozed in its carrier, unaware of its crucial role in what was becoming a dangerous mission to expose the truth. Clara's fear was still there, a constant presence in her chest, but it was now matched by a fierce resolve. She had found her leverage, and she wasn't going to back down. The sunset painted the canyon walls in deep oranges and reds as Clara pulled into her driveway, scanning the area for any sign of intrusion. The carved thread on her door seemed to stand out more starkly in the fading light, but instead of intimidating her, it now felt like confirmation that she was on the right track. Whatever happened next, she knew she had to keep pushing forward, keep gathering evidence, keep fighting back against the shadows that threatened both her and the wildlife she had sworn to protect. Sarah's cryptic warning stayed with Clara as she dove into the records. With trembling fingers, she pulled file after file, scanning through years of documented wildlife incidents. The kitten dozed in a carrier beside her desk, occasionally making soft chirping sounds that steadied her nerves. 3 hours into her research, Clara's eyes widened. She leaned forward, heart pounding as she read the details of a wildlife survey from 2 years ago. A small population of genetically distinct bobcats had been discovered in the northern canyon areas. What made them special was a rare genetic marker that produced unusually vivid golden eyes and distinctive markings, exactly like the kitten she had rescued. "Oh my God," Clara whispered, glancing at the sleeping kitten. The report detailed how wildlife authorities had carefully tagged and monitored this unique bloodline, hoping to protect it. But over the past year, several tagged animals had mysteriously disappeared. Clara's hands shook as she opened more recent files. The pattern was clear. Each disappearance had been reported in areas where Raymond Kettler had been spotted hunting. These weren't random acts of poaching. He was systematically targeting these specific bobcats. She pulled out her phone and snapped photos of the key documents, her mind racing. The kitten wasn't just any bobcat, it was living proof of Raymond's organized trafficking operation. No wonder he was so desperate to get it back. Clara gathered her things and hurried to her truck. The carrier held close. She needed to tell someone, needed to make them understand the gravity of what she'd discovered. Her first stop was the veterinary clinic where Iris worked. The bell chimed as Clara pushed through the door, the familiar antiseptic smell greeting her. Iris looked up from the reception desk, her dark curls escaping from her ponytail. "Clara, what's wrong?" Iris asked, immediately noting her friend's agitated state. "I need to show you something," Clara said, leading them to a private exam room. She set down the carrier and pulled out her phone, showing Iris the photographs of the wildlife reports. "Look at these dates, these locations. Raymond's been specifically hunting these rare bobcats. They're worth a fortune to collectors because of their unique genetics." Iris studied the evidence, her expression growing more serious with each swipe of the screen. "This is organized trafficking," she said finally, looking up at Clara. "This isn't just about one angry hunter. This is systematic criminal activity?" "Exactly," Clara nodded, relieved that someone finally understood. "And this little one," she gestured to the carrier, "it's one of them. Look at its eyes, the marking pattern. It matches the documented bloodline perfectly." Iris straightened up, her jaw set firmly. Clara, you can't keep this quiet. This is exactly the kind of evidence law enforcement needs to stop these operations. You have to tell Nate. Clara's stomach tightened at the mention of her brother. Their last conversation had left her feeling dismissed and belittled. But Iris was right. This was bigger than their sibling rivalry. I'll go to the station right now, Clara decided, gathering her things. Will you come with me? Iris squeezed her hand. Of course, you shouldn't have to do this alone. 20 minutes later, they walked into the sheriff's department. Clara spotted Nate at his desk, his deputy's badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He looked up as they approached, his expression guarded. Clara, he said carefully, what brings you here? I need you to look at something, Clara replied, keeping her voice steady. And this time, I need you to really listen. She laid out the evidence methodically, the wildlife reports, the documented bloodline, the pattern of disappearances that aligned with Raymond's movements. She showed him photos of the kitten, pointing out the distinctive features that marked it as part of the targeted population. This isn't about me being emotional or overprotective, Clara said firmly. This is about organized wildlife trafficking. Raymond is deliberately hunting these animals because they're valuable to collectors. That's why he's been threatening me. I have living proof of his crimes. Nate leaned back in his chair, studying the documents spread across his desk. The skepticism in his eyes slowly gave way to something else. Professional interest. These disappearances, he said, pointing to the dates, they match some reports we've had about suspicious vehicles in those areas. But we never had enough evidence to connect the dots. Now you do, Clara said quietly. The kitten I rescued isn't just any bobcat. It's part of this endangered bloodline. That's why Raymond won't back down. Nate was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming on his desk. Clara held her breath, waiting. Finally, he looked up at her, and she saw something shift in his expression, a grudging respect. He might be onto something here, he admitted. This kind of organized trafficking, it's a serious federal offense. We'll need to bring in fish and wildlife service, set up a proper investigation. Relief flooded through Clara, making her knees weak. Iris steadied her with a supportive hand on her shoulder. But Clara, Nate continued, his voice taking on a protective edge she hadn't heard in years. This makes your situation more dangerous, not less. If Raymond is part of a larger trafficking operation, he has a lot to lose. You need to be extremely careful. Clara nodded, glancing down at the carrier where the kitten slept, unaware of its crucial role in exposing these crimes. I know, she said softly, but I can't walk away from this. Not now that I understand what's really happening. Nate stood up, gathering the documents into a file. I'll make some calls right now. We'll need to get statements from you and Iris, document everything properly. He paused, meeting Clara's eyes. You did good work here, sis. I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner. The words weren't quite an apology, but they were a start. Clara felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, not just from the validation of her concerns, but from the first step toward healing their strained relationship, as they waited for Nate to make his calls. Iris squeezed Clara's hand. You know this isn't over, right? Raymond won't stop just because we've figured out his game. Clara looked down at the carrier, where two golden eyes blinked back at her sleepily. I know, she said quietly, but at least now we know what we're really fighting for. It's not just about saving one kitten anymore. It's about stopping this whole operation. The gravity of what she'd uncovered settled over her like a heavy cloak. She had stumbled onto something much bigger than she'd initially realized, and there would be no walking away from it now. The kitten's soft purr reminded her why it was worth the risk. Some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Clara surveyed the rehabilitation center's treatment room, her heart pounding. With nervous energy, the space had been carefully arranged, security cameras hidden in strategic corners, officers positioned discreetly throughout the building, and the rescued Bobcat Kitten safely secured in its indoor enclosure. Everything's set, Iris confirmed, adjusting the medical supplies on a nearby counter. The social media post about the kitten's recovery went live an hour ago. If Raymond's watching, he'll know exactly where to find it. Nate stepped into the room, his deputy uniform crisp and official. My team's in position, he said, checking his radio. Fish and wildlife agents are covering the perimeter. We've got eyes on every entrance. Clara nodded, trying to steady her trembling hands. Thank you both for believing in me, she said softly. I couldn't have done this alone. That's what family's for, Nate replied, surprising her with the warmth in his voice. Even when we're being stubborn about it, the weight felt endless. Clara busied herself with routine tasks, checking supplies, monitoring the kitten, updating charts. Iris stayed close, providing quiet support and watchful companionship. At 9:45 in the evening, the security system picked up movement at the rear entrance. Clara's breath caught as she watched the monitor. Raymond's familiar figure appeared, accompanied by two other men she didn't recognize. They're here, she whispered into her radio. Following the rehearsed plan, the intruders moved with practiced efficiency, disabling the basic alarm system. They didn't know about the secondary measures Nate had installed, or the officers waiting. In darkness, Clara heard the soft click of the back door, then footsteps in the corridor. Her hands shook as she continued her pretend work. Aware of Iris's steadying presence beside her, the treatment room door burst open. Raymond stood there, flanked by his associates, his face twisted with familiar anger. "Where's my property?" he demanded. Clara straightened her spine, facing him directly. "Wildlife isn't property, Raymond, and you're not taking this one." The flash of movement was sudden, Raymond lunging forward, his companions spreading out to block the exits, but they had walked right into the trap. "Police, freeze." Nate's voice boomed through the room as officers emerged from their hiding spots, weapons drawn. Chaos erupted. Raymond's associates bolted, crashing through the emergency exit and triggering alarms. 2 officers pursued them into the night. Raymond himself stood frozen, his face contorted with disbelief as Nate approached with handcuffs. "Raymond Kettler, you're under arrest for wildlife trafficking, criminal threatening, and attempted theft of endangered species." Clara watched as her brother efficiently secured the handcuffs, reading Raymond his rights. The surge of triumph she felt was dizzying. After weeks of fear and frustration, justice was finally being served. Through it all, the Bobcat Kitten remained calm in its enclosure, watching the scene with curious golden eyes. Clara moved to stand protectively in front of it, her heart still racing but her spirits soaring. For the first time since that evening on the canyon rim, she felt truly vindicated. Clara's momentary triumph shattered like glass in the dead of night. The acrid smell of smoke jolted her awake in her small office at the rehabilitation center, where she had stayed late to monitor the recovering animals. Thick, dark clouds were already rolling through the hallway, and an orange glow flickered ominously from the direction of the main entrance. Her heart hammering against her ribs, Clara scrambled to her feet. The Bobcat Kitten, sleeping in its carrier nearby, let out a frightened mewl. Through the growing haze, she could make out Raymond's silhouette through the window, his face twisted with rage as he watched the flames climb higher. No, Clara whispered, coughing as the smoke grew denser. The fire was spreading fast, eating through the wooden structures with terrifying speed. She could hear the panicked sounds of the other animals, the injured hawk in its cage, the recovering deer in the back pen, all of them trapped and terrified, with trembling hands. Clara scooped up the kitten's carrier. The heat was becoming unbearable, sweat running down her face as she tried to find a way out. The main entrance was completely engulfed in flames now, forcing her deeper into the building. Behind her, support beams groaned and crackled ominously. The smoke was so thick she could barely see, and her lungs burned with every breath. Clara dropped to her knees, crawling along the floor where the air was clearer. The kitten's frightened cries spurred her forward, even as despair threatened to overwhelm her. They were running out of time. Through watering eyes, she spotted a faint rectangle of moonlight, a window in the back room. It was their only chance. Clara pulled herself forward, the carrier clutched tightly in one hand. Just then, a thunderous crash behind her announced the collapse of part of the ceiling, sending sparks and burning debris raining down. The window was small, but it had to be enough. Clara set down the carrier long enough to grab a metal chair, smashing it against the glass with all her remaining strength. The window shattered, and she quickly pulled the kitten from its carrier, holding it close to her chest. "Hold on, little one," she whispered hoarsely, wrapping her arms protectively around the trembling creature. With one final surge of desperate energy, Clara threw herself through the broken window just as another section of the building collapsed behind her. She hit the ground hard, rolling away from the burning building with the kitten still clutched safely against her. Her arms were cut from the glass, her clothes were singed, and every breath felt like fire in her chest. But they were alive. From her position on the ground, Clara watched in horror as the rehabilitation center, her workplace, her sanctuary was consumed by flames. Years of work, countless animals helped and healed, all going up in smoke because of one man's vengeful fury. Tears streamed down her soot-stained face as she held the kitten closer, its tiny heart beating rapidly against her own. Her moment of victory had turned to ashes, literally and figuratively. Raymond had struck back with devastating force, and the cost was almost too much to bear. In the soft light of dawn, Clara sat wrapped in a blanket on Nate's worn leather couch. The Bobcat Kitten curled protectively against her chest. Her clothes still smelled of smoke, and angry red scratches marked her arms from the desperate escape through the burning rehabilitation center. The events of the night played over and over in her mind, like a haunting film reel. Nate appeared from the kitchen, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. His deputy's badge caught the morning light as he settled into the armchair across from her. For a long moment, he just looked at his sister, his expression heavy with regret. "I should have believed you from the start," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "When you first came to me about Raymond, I thought you were just being you, always fighting for the underdog, always seeing conspiracies where there weren't any." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "But you were right. You've always had good instincts about these things." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the coffee. "I needed you, Nate. I needed my big brother." "I know," he replied softly, "and I failed you, but not anymore." He leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers with fierce determination. "We're going to stop him, Clara. Raymond's gone too far. The arson, the trafficking, the threats. We've got enough to build a real case now. The kitten stirred against Clara's chest, making a small chirping sound. She stroked its fur gently, feeling its steady heartbeat against her palm. He won't stop, she whispered. Not until he gets what he wants. Then we'll be ready, Nate assured her. He pulled out his phone as it buzzed with a text message. That's Iris. She's on her way over. We need to plan our next move carefully. Clara felt something shift inside her as she watched her brother take charge. The wall of distance that had grown between them over the years began to crumble, replaced by the warmth of remembered trust. She remembered how he had always protected her when they were children, before life and differences had pulled them apart. Iris arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a bag of medical supplies. As she treated Clara's cuts and burns, the three of them began to strategize. The kitten moved between them, seeming to sense the gravity of their discussion. Raymond's desperate now, Nate explained, spreading out a map of the area. He's exposed, and he knows it. That makes him dangerous, but it also makes him vulnerable. Clara nodded, feeling a new strength flow through her. With her brother and her best friend beside her, the weight of fear began to lift. She wasn't alone anymore. The path ahead would be dangerous, but for the first time since this all began, she felt truly ready to face it. Whatever comes next, she said firmly, we face it together. The kitten pressed against her leg, a small but mighty reminder of why this fight mattered. Clara knew with absolute certainty that she would see this through to the end. No matter what it took, Raymond had to be stopped. Not just for her sake, but for every animal he had ever harmed or planned to harm. Dark clouds rolled across the northern Arizona sky as Clara made her way along the familiar canyon rim. Her heart pounded against her ribs. The kitten secure in her backpack, the same path where everything had begun, now felt different, more threatening. Yet somehow right for this final confrontation. Heavy raindrops began to fall, pattering against the red rocks and creating slick patches on the trail. The wind whipped Clara's hair around her face as she carefully navigated the treacherous terrain. She knew Raymond would come. This was where he had first lost his prize, and his twisted sense of revenge would draw him back here. A crack of thunder rolled across the canyon just as Clara heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Raymond emerging from the shadows of a large boulder, his face twisted with malice and determination. Finally decided to stop running. He snarled, taking deliberate steps toward her. Hand over the cat, and maybe I'll let you walk away. Clara backed away slowly, her shoes finding purchase on the wet rocks. Years of working in this landscape had taught her every contour, every safe foothold. It's over, Raymond. We know about the trafficking ring. Law enforcement is already moving in on your associates. Raymond's laugh was harsh and cold. You think I care about them? This is about you and me now. In 3 quick strides, he closed the distance between them. Before Clara could react, he grabbed the backpack, yanking it from her shoulders. The kitten yowled in protest as Raymond held it out over the canyon edge. Rain lashed against them both as Clara's heart nearly stopped. One more step, Raymond threatened, and I drop it. How's that for poetic justice? Clara forced herself to remain still, though every fiber of her being screamed to rush forward. The canyon drop was hundreds of feet. No animal could survive that fall. She watched Raymond's eyes, seeing the desperate madness there, and knew he meant every word. You don't have to do this, she said, keeping her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Think about what you're doing. Murder, arson, animal trafficking. You're only making it worse for yourself. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the scene in stark relief. Clara noticed something Raymond hadn't. The way the rain was undermining the loose gravel where he stood. If she could just get him to shift his weight, you've ruined everything, Raymond spat, taking another step backward. My reputation, my business. All because you couldn't mind your own business. Clara took a careful step to her left, forcing Raymond to adjust his position. Maybe that's exactly what this was about. Someone finally standing up to you. The ground beneath Raymond's feet began to shift. He wobbled slightly, his grip on the kitten loosening for just a moment. Clara saw her chance and lunged forward, not toward Raymond, but toward a sturdy outcropping just to his right. Raymond instinctively moved to block her, but the motion was too much for the unstable ground. With a startled cry, he lost his footing. The kitten wriggled free of his grasp as he fell, and Clara snatched it from the air in one fluid motion. Raymond tumbled backward, rolling down a steep incline before becoming trapped in a natural pocket of rocks 20 feet below the rim. He lay there groaning, unable to climb out of the natural prison the canyon had created. The sound of sirens pierced through the storm's fury. Flashlight beams cut through the growing darkness as Nate and several other officers approached from multiple directions. They had been waiting, tracking both Clara and Raymond, ready to move in at the perfect moment. Clara, Nate called out, rushing to his sister's side. Are you all right? Clara nodded, clutching the kitten close to her chest. She was soaked to the bone and shaking, but unharmed. Below them, 2 officers were already making their way down to where Raymond lay trapped. Reading him his rights as they placed him in handcuffs, the rain began to ease as more emergency vehicles arrived, their lights painting the wet canyon walls. In alternating red and blue, Clara watched as Raymond was led away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The nightmare was finally over. You did it, Nate said softly, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. You actually did it. The kitten purred against Clara's chest, seemingly unaware of how close it had come to disaster. Clara stroked its wet fur, feeling the weight of the past weeks lifting from her shoulders. Justice had been served, not just for this one small creature, but for all the animals Raymond had victimized. In the days following Raymond's arrest, the full scope of his criminal enterprise unraveled like a poorly knitted sweater. Local news stations buzzed with reports of the sophisticated animal trafficking ring that had operated under everyone's noses. Law enforcement discovered detailed records of rare species sold to wealthy collectors across 3 different countries, with prices that made seasoned investigators whistle in disbelief. Clara watched it all unfold from the comfort of her rebuilt workspace at the rehabilitation center. The kitten, now officially named Shadow for its habit of following Clara everywhere, lounged contentedly on her desk as she sorted through paperwork. The little creature had grown stronger, its coat glossy and full, but showed no interest in returning to the wild. Instead, it had claimed Clara as its chosen family. Look at you two, Iris said one morning, leaning against the doorframe with a knowing smile. I've never seen a rescue bond quite like this before. Clara scratched Shadow behind the ears, earning a thunderous purp. Sometimes the animals choose us, she replied softly. The community's perception of Clara shifted dramatically. Where once they had seen a quiet, perhaps overly cautious wildlife assistant, they now recognized someone who had stood firm against genuine danger. Local schools invited her to speak about wildlife conservation. Even the gruff old-timers at the general store tipped their hats to her with newfound respect. One evening, as sunset painted the canyon walls in warm amber light, Nate stopped by Clara's cabin. He found her on the porch, Shadow curled in her lap, both of them watching the sky change colors. Got the final report today, he said, settling into the chair beside her. Raymond's looking at 15 years minimum. His whole network's been exposed. Seems like you started quite the domino effect. Clara nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. It needed to be done. You know, Nate continued, his voice softening with unusual emotion, I spent years thinking I needed to protect you and worried you were too gentle for this harsh world. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But you weren't the soft one. You were the strong one, all along. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, touched by this rare moment of vulnerability from her brother. Shadow, sensing her emotion, pressed closer against her chest. I just did what needed to be done, she said simply. That's exactly what makes you strong, Nate replied. You saw what was right and stood your ground, no matter the cost. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in deepening purples, Clara felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The fear that had once haunted these quiet evenings had transformed into something else, a quiet confidence, a knowledge of her own capabilities. Shadow's warm weight against her chest was a constant reminder of the moment she had chosen to stand her ground. The moment that had revealed who she truly was. She wasn't just the quiet wildlife assistant anymore. She was someone who had faced down danger and emerged stronger, someone who had given voice to the voiceless, and in saving Shadow, she had ultimately saved herself. If even one moment stayed with you, hit subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another story, written gently, for the heart.